Thank you for joining us for this President Speaker Series Election Year special event, Truth, Fiction, and Alternative Facts. Please welcome California State University Monterey Bay's President, Eduardo M. Ochoa.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to CSU Monterey Bay's Fall President Speaker Series event. I'm Eduardo Ochoa, President of CSUMB. In the midst of our U.S. presidential debates in 3 weeks from the 2020 election, I am excited to present our speakers for this afternoon discussion on truth, fiction, and alternative facts, an exploration of how the changing media landscape is shaping and influencing U.S. elections. Before I make those introductions, I would like to provide a framing for this choice of topics. In the last 100 years, the landscape of communications media has seen three great waves of change with the advent of radio, television, and the internet. Each wave has dominated U.S. culture for a period of 3 to 4 decades. In each of these waves, the diversity of voices has gradually progressed from the three dominant broadcast networks of radio and television in the early to mid-20th century to the cable television and 24/7 news networks of the late 20th century, and now the rise of the internet in the 21st century. With this increase in the diversity of voices and proliferation of choices for entertainment and information, a troubling problem has emerged, a growing difficulty in discerning truth or provably factual information. For those of you over the age of 50, you can remember a time when the news content of the three major broadcast networks was largely uniform, with little difference in what was presented as newsworthy or verifiable facts. The editorial emphasis on credible sources and verification of information was a hallmark of journalism in both broadcast and print mediums. In short, assertions of facts were largely uniform across daily networks' news broadcasts, and the assumptions of these assertions as truth were equally uniform. The rise of cable television and 24/7 news networks changed this equation, with networks competing to build and retain viewership by creating global feeds of information and encouraging opinion and analysis content to inform and entertain their viewers. What is now termed newstainment started to appeal to differing audiences with the intent of building viewer loyalty and associated advertising revenues by having a specific skew or slant to the content of the network. This is apparent to anyone who watches networks such as MSNBC or Fox News and marvels at the difference in content between these news networks. With the rise of the internet, this diversity of voices has proliferated to a level of chaos that has become a potential threat to the idea of broadly accepted truths. The open nature of authoring and content creation made possible by social media and the internet has created an opportunity for the creation and insertion of false information into what has generally been believed as news. This spread of misinformation has been seized by corporate, social, and political interests as a means to influence public opinion in elections, seen most notably in the influence of Russian actors in the 2016 presidential election. With the 2020 election upon us, and acknowledgement from the U.S. intelligence agencies that similar activities are being attempted once again, it seemed appropriate to convene a discussion around not only the large-scale attempts to use misinformation to influence the electorate, but also the smaller-scale attempts to use truth fiction and alternative facts in the news medium of the present to influence elections. We have today with us a talented group of political communications professionals representing a diversity of views and political opinions. Moderating our discussion will be Zach Friend, noted author and resident of the Monterey region. A public policy and communications expert, Zach has worked for Barack Obama and John Kerry's presidential campaigns, the White House Council of Economic Advisors, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Democratic National Committee. Welcome, Zach. Today's panelists include Mike Madrid, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, past political director of the California Republican Party, and a nationally recognized expert on Latino voting trends. Currently, Mike also serves as an adjunct lecturer on race, class, and partisanship at the University of Southern California. Glad to have you with us. Amanda Renteria, CEO of Code for America. Amanda has served as National Political Director for Secretary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, as Chief of Operations at the California Department of Justice, and as a U.S. Senate Chief of Staff. Thank you. Welcome, Amanda. Matt Gorman, former Communications Director and Rapid Response Director for the National Republican Congressional Committee. Matt also served as Rapid Response Director for Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign and as an aide to Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. Linda Tran, founding partner, Chief Public Affairs and Communication Strategies at 270 Strategies. Linda is also a CBS News political contributor, columnist, and frequent commentator, and has developed public engagement strategies for some of the country's most watched congressional and gubernatorial races. And Paulette Aniskov, partner of Bully Pulpit Interactive. Paulette is a former Deputy Assistant to the Secretary and Director of the Office of Public Engagement at the Obama White House. Prior to that role, Paulette served as Director of Individual and Community Preparedness at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for their support of California public higher education and of CSU Monterey Bay, and specifically laud them for waiving any fees to appear here today. That's very kind of them. As most of you know, these are difficult financial times for California public education, so we appreciate that. Despite these difficulties, through public support such as demonstrated by our panelists, CSUMB will continue to advance our mission of public service and education. And with that, let me hand off today's event to our moderator, Zach Friend.
Thank you, President Ochoa. Thank you all for participating in today's event, both those watching as well as the panelists. I'm going to get straight into this because I'm hoping that the panelists can also do some interplay here and make sure that if you hear something that somebody else is saying, feel free to try and chime in. I'm going to start with Linda and Matt, and specifically I'm going to kick it off with Linda. Linda, you are a CBS contributor, and one of the things that's discussed a lot right now is whether or not people live in these silos as far as information. But CBS is a very traditional network, and when you look at polling, is viewed as very middle of the road, both on the number of people, the type of people that view it, as well as the information that's provided. What are your thoughts on a network like CBS and how they're able, from an editorial standpoint, to remain relatively neutral? Or is it a challenge for a network like that? And how do you see that they compare versus places like, say, a Fox News or some of these other media websites that may not have the same type of editorial discretion?
It's a great question, Zach, and it's one of the reasons why I've been really proud to be part of the CBS brand over the last several years. It is definitely part of the history and certainly some of what the execs have talked about being core to the future. One thing I would say is that while CBS is conventional in a lot of ways and obviously has this long and storied history and tradition, it also found itself on the cutting edge, starting 24/7 interactive news platform, CBSN in particular, which is where I spend a lot of my time. And it's also a place where it allows the network to really explore some of the issues that people are thinking about at home. One of the more recent segments that they created was specifically about the impact that Asian Americans are experiencing right now because of some racism related to the coronavirus, because of some of the rhetoric that we've heard out of this White House that is impacting communities that look like me. So I'm really proud of the way that the network has been able to be both balanced in the way that it assesses what's going on in the world and also able to just push the envelope and probe into things that we think are really important to everyday Americans watching from all over the place.
Thanks, Linda. And Matt, you and I have been on Fox News a number of times on opposite sides, but always in a very respectful way, which I've always admired about your approach, your balanced approach. I wanted to read you something that Pew Research actually did regarding COVID. This just came out a couple days ago. 90% of Republicans who only indicated Fox News and or a talk radio as a major source of their political news said that the country has controlled the outbreak as much as it could. But among Republicans who rely on neither Fox News nor talk radio, but watch shows such as CBS, NBC, or read the New York Times, only half as many, or 46%, say the U.S. controlled the outbreak as well as it could. So I just wanted to ask you, as somebody who's not just been on Fox News, but has worked in Republican circles, how you've seen Fox influence opinion, and how you would say for viewers to be able to separate fact from, say, an infotainment, as President Ochoa had mentioned. In essence, those hosts that are more there for entertainment versus those hosts that are more for journalism.
Yeah, no, and first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with all of you and really appreciate the time. Look, I think one of the misnomers sometimes I think people have is, look, according to data, cable news is followed by a religious audience. And I mean that both ideologically, like if you are a Republican, you watch Fox News, MS, Democrat, I think also CNN is now veered into the Democratic thing, but also you watch it, the same people watch cable news day to day. You're not usually weaving in and out, according to some of the data. So I actually think, though, that a lot of that effect has come from the top, right? It's come from Trump, and it's come through whether you watch CBSN, CBS, or whatever, because they're still covering the president of the United States. So the politicization of COVID, master perfect example, is something I think that has come from the top. I think it's lamentable in many respects. But you're right, too, the infotainment versus the news aspect on all networks, right? You look at whether it's Cuomo and Don Lemon on CNN, you look at Hannity and Tucker on Fox, Maddow Hayes on MSNBC, that line can get blurred because especially, too, you'll then have a guy like Brian Williams, who in theory should be a down the middle anchor at 11. So those lines get blurred. And look, I think at the end of the day, I'll shy away from Fox and MSNBC. CNN is a perfect example of it where, look, at the end of the day, these are businesses, right? They're chasing ratings. They want eyeballs. Trump has given plentiful to all three networks in terms of making sure they have ratings and money. And so what happens when he leaves office, whether in 3 months or in 4 years, is going to be a reckoning for a lot of these networks who have over-leveraged themselves on, feeding the beast with Trump content, so to speak.
Well, if I may, one thing I would add, though, is having done my share of time on all of those networks that Matt just mentioned, there is very much a really distinctive difference in the style of how these segments are put together and what choices the producers and the networks make about the direction they want the conversation to flow. And part of what has made CBS, CBSN, some of the others, ABC, NBC, a little different is that they don't set out to be soundbitey. It is more about analysis and trying to get information to viewers that will help them shape their perspective on what's going on in politics and beyond.
Well, thanks, Linda, and thanks, Matt, for that. I actually wanted to bring in Amanda on this as well. Amanda, I mean, you were the 2016 political director of the Clinton campaign, and I mean, there was a lot of siloed information then, and there's a lot more now coming into 2020. I mean, what do you think of some of Matt raises good points that these are business decisions ultimately that these networks are making, but at the end of the day, I don't know that the viewers necessarily know that. This COVID data that was just provided by Pew shows that it actually shapes how somebody views a pandemic. I mean, that you would think that this would be an easily discernible fact, but based on the media that you consume, you have a fundamentally different view of what's going on in the health of the country. I mean, what is your sense both from 2016 and today about how this siloed information is playing out?
It's unfortunate. I think it used to be that news, or really when we talked about news, it wasn't entertainment, it was education. And I think when we think about political leaders who actually, the way they use media and the way they use news really does matter as well. Are you looking to entertain folks, or are you looking to truly educate and lead a society? What has happened is it has become entertaining for folks. I think what Trump brought in and what we saw as a tactic is that entertainment can build a platform. And now the question is, over the last 4 years, how has that been used? Has it really been used to educate and inform people about a political process, about governing of a country, about responsibility as an American? And unfortunately, what's happened over the last 4 years is I think we have seen a movie and we have seen a show, and that's actually made it very difficult for any news organization to say, how do I play in a space where maybe education's a little bit more boring than entertainment. And so all of a sudden everyone's pushed to sound bites, especially when there are new mechanisms for talking to voters, for talking to Americans. And I think that's the big question for this campaign in 2020 versus 2016, is there was still a sense of news, information, and education as opposed to entertainment. Now any campaign that's out there has to do both. You have to both be entertaining as well as figure out a way to educate people in a very, very busy world where, you know, every soundbite can actually get amplified or go viral at any moment. And that's really the tall task that any campaign has today.
Well, if you don't mind me jumping in, look, I in some ways disagree with that, because if you look at Mitt Romney in 2012, that was essentially the campaign season of the gaffes, right? You had these minor moments that blew up, and they blew up very hot but very quickly. And so it was never, I think the good old days, I don't believe really were ever there, especially with the advent of cable news. I do think, though, there is an evolution, though. Look, in essence, Trump is the perfect president for the media cycle of our time, where we are consuming endless content in endless spaces. And Trump is the living embodiment of giving everyone endless content for whatever they want. And if you don't like it, wait a few minutes, because he'll do something else, whether you agree with it or not. And I think in a way it's played into where the media cycle is going, and it's chicken and egg. Maybe he let it, maybe he played into it. And, you know, certainly the fact that he tweets about how the ratings of press conferences or the ratings of rallies or GOP conventions, it shows to where his mind is at.
Yeah, just to answer back, I agree that Trump has brought in a new layer of how we treat media in this world in general, in this country in general. But he is leading a country. And I think that's what makes it quite different in 2016 versus 2020, which is these facts do matter in people's lives. It's not just a campaign and it's not just a game. It's a matter of literally life and death. It's a matter of your economy. There are real things going on in the world, in the country, that people do need to respond to. And it does shape the way people behave. And that's the part that's really difficult. As people discern what to do in this election cycle, but really just as what you discern to do in your community and your everyday life.
Look, Mike and Paulette, we're going to bring you into this now because, Mike, I think Amanda and Matt set you up perfectly for this. Amanda was talking about how to entertain and get information across. Look, you're the co-founder of the Lincoln Project. You are a Republican that is doing everything you can to not just ensure that the president isn't reelected, but also that the United States Senate flips, and you're doing it disproportionately with social media. And so what I wanted to talk to you and Paulette about, but I'll start with you, Mike, is talk to me about and talk to the audience about why. I mean, what we've focused on so far was quote unquote traditional media. I mean, Linda's in quasi-traditional, although CBSN is a little bit more modern. Fox News is much more siloed, but social media has no check and balance per se. So talk to me and the audience about why it is that you're electing to use social media as a way to try and help influence the 2020 election, and how people that are following these kinds of things can discern fact from fiction in the social media realm as well.
Well, look, it's a great question. Thank you again for having me, Zach, and CSU Monterey Bay. It's a pleasure to be with you. I do want to say I agree with real insightful commentary from all of the panelists that spoke before me. But in a way, what they're really characterizing is the failure of modern media to really, I think, serve the role of what media companies should be doing. And I've got a lot of my own gripes with the media, not that they're fake news or the criticisms that the president has, but that they're in a very competitive environment where they have to speak to very small niches that monetize their news platforms, right? And incidentally, I don't agree that MSNBC is any different than Fox News or is any different than CNN. They're all doing the same thing. They're all trying to hold on to their market share, and they've all changed the nature of journalism. So with the Lincoln Project, what we did was we recognized that. We saw what Donald Trump did, and he was very easily manipulated the media because he had a keen awareness of this and utilized his own social media platform to essentially have the cable news and broadcast channels chase whatever he was doing. And whenever one or two would follow, then the others would have to follow. And so it created this really unfortunate circumstance where journalists were following whatever this politician was saying. And the more brash and the more vulgar and the more over the top he could be, the more our media silos really began to degenerate. What we did at the Lincoln Project is we turned that whole model on its head. What we recognized was if we created our own social media channels with our own social media reach, with our own content at a rate as faster than the president, that we could actually not only compete with the president, we could actually move the whole national narrative and at the same time contain what the president was promulgating on his own channels by pointing out specifically where he was being a liar, candidly, or where he was on the wrong side of the vast majority of the American public. And that was, I think, necessary to contain the spread of Trump and Trumpism and this really peculiar way of communicating through the mass media and driving a media discussion where the traditional role, back when we had really only 3 broadcast television stations, could do a better job of their journalistic role of monitoring what actually it was that was newsworthy and content-worthy. So in many ways, what we did is we out-Trumped. That's been the kind of the goal, is to have more access to social media channels, utilize that same technique that he used to drive the cable and broadcast narratives around what we were doing, and in doing so, limit what the president was doing. So I think we took it a step beyond what the presidents did in 2016 and worked to use it to his disadvantage.
So you're using, to some degree, Mike, a low-cost mechanism, i.e. social media, but enjoying a significant amount of what would be considered in the communications business earned media, because Fox, well, I guess Fox maybe not as much, but CNN, MSNBC, and others are covering what you're doing for free. Is that part of the proposal to try and trade up that chain like that?
Yeah, and let me be clear. Yeah, essentially, yes, but let me spend a little bit more time on it and clarify it too. What we're doing with the media is to drive a national narrative. It's not how we're actually driving votes, right? There's 2 components to what the Lincoln Project does. The first is to actually move Republican votes. That's not what we're here to talk about today, but that's the vast majority of what we do. What we recognized was by utilizing the same techniques that the president used, only better and through different sources and faster, we could actually use through what now we call earned media, which means driving the attention of the media to what it is that we want to focus on through videos and through advertisements and through traditional earned media venues, the control of the national debate. That's never been done before. No one's ever tried it really before. That's how I think we've redefined it, because we understand that the media is going to chase what we're putting out there, the same way they chased what the president put out there. And you have to really understand the importance of that. That is a relatively new phenomenon. This is something that no politician prior to Trump really had ever done quite well, although a lot of presidents who had the bully pulpit would do their traditional news conference and knowing that the broadcast and cable companies would have to cover them. This is a much more aggressive time frame in a way to completely dominate these companies and literally dictates to them what not only is news, but whatever it is they want to cover, whether it's factual, truthful, or not. We know the president's going to get up on stage and lie. We know that's going to happen. And 9 times out of 10, all of these companies are going to cover it. Why? Because they have to. They've created their own media silo where they've got no choice. What the Lincoln Project did was it gave it an alternative voice. It gave it a referendum to point back and push back on the president and say, this is our competing narrative. This is who we think the president is. We attacked it on social media. And I guess in a way, Zach, you used a really interesting term, earned media. That's kind of what we used to go out and hold a press conference and have the local paper kind of show up, right? That doesn't really exist anymore because of the decline of that type of journalism. What we've created was the venue and the content, the quality of the content, to drive an alternative voice that the media now has to also not has to cover, but chooses to cover, because finally it gives them the opportunity to break out of this circling down the drain dynamic that Trump created and they followed along with.
Oh, I think we're going to have a lot more to talk about in this regard, because I think that there's a lot of points that are being raised here about then how easy it is, and I'm not going to say this in a pejorative way, but to manipulate that narrative, right? I mean, because, and what I think a large part of this discussion today is how do you're a voter, right? How do you then extract fact from fiction in that, as evidenced by if we can't even agree on the sky being blue because one network's saying it's gray and the other's saying it's blue, that is problematic for a lot of things moving forward. Paulette, I'm going to bring you in, and I want the other panelists to talk about this as well. Paulette, in many respects, I viewed, we worked together in 2008 on the Obama campaign. You were a rock star then, you're a rock star now. You did a lot on the 2012 outreach for the president and in the White House. But things have changed. It almost seems like a lifetime ago from 2012 and beyond when you were in the White House as the director of engagement. How would you under this current landscape even reach people? I mean, compared to what you were doing then, and you were working very hard on reaching young voters and young members of the population, people of color. How now would you recommend for a Joe Biden or a President Trump or anybody, how would you advise them to also break through that noise to also be relevant?
Sure. Well, I'll start with, some lessons learned from the White House. I have to say, healthcare was just a perfect example of a place where we needed to reach people that the White House press corps did not reach at all. And the White House spends a huge part of its day preparing for the White House press corps. And that's how it works. And in my office, our goal was to enroll people in healthcare. So we knew we had to sort of pull out of that and think about where to find people in that dynamic. And, I don't know if folks remember this, but just one example of that was Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. And I remember telling Valerie Jarrett what Between Two Ferns was and trying to explain why it was funny and how many people watched it, and trying to find the example of one that was the least ridiculous. So she would approve that we could kind of move on to the next level. But we were trying to figure out, how do we reach out to people who are online all the time? We, through a huge number of nonprofit organizations, reached out to people who are just tougher to reach online and people who are really in underserved communities. But it was a little bit of a shock to the system, I think, in the White House. And we just kept pushing and pushing and finding YouTube stars that, people working at the White House hadn't heard of before. And very few of them pass vet, it turns out, that kind of thing. But trying to figure out, how do you engage this whole new set of people that are outside of the people in that press room? And obviously President Obama and is a great person to talk directly to people, and many politicians now sort of use the let's go direct through social media. And I would say that, in this campaign cycle, we're now in a place where, we don't have door knocking like we did back in 2008, right? Everything, the entire campaign is really online. So we've got to figure out how is it that we can reach people. And, my firm and many other people are working on the digital strategy with Biden's campaign and trying to figure out every possible stone that can be unturned. Gamers, YouTube, going beyond sort of the typical even media platforms that we did use, fantasy football, where else can you go to find people that we think are going to bring some energy and hopefully vote for us? So it is just a completely different place. And I think nowadays, it seems not that long ago, but something like Between Two Ferns seems like very mainstream and not a big deal, but it felt like a very big deal in 2013 and was hard to get approved. And now that's sort of like where we go first to find a lot of people, particularly young people, people of color. They're not watching cable a lot of times, so we have to go and find them. Being where people are, that is what we're gonna do.
So meeting people where they are, that seems like an excellent transition point. But I'm not gonna let you get away with using an inside the beltway term. You said that they didn't pass vet. I think everybody on this knows what that is, but for those watching at home, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, because we had a slightly different standard than Donald Trump. We wanted to make sure that everyone who was with the president in a video, anything that he was doing, the person was not going to have anything from a huge tax lien to a horrible thing they had said in the past to public comments that were racist, whatever it might be. And it turns out, vetters are very busy. these days, because those things really travel, and if you don't get prepared for them, someone else will. So pretty much all the people who came into the White House or certainly filmed something, you have to go through a vetting process, and we take your information and see if there's any dirt to dig up. And that was true also, the appointments process, the whole thing. Lots of vetters in the Obama White House. I think they used those positions to do something else in the recent administration.
Well, thanks, Paulette, for that inside look at what vetting is. And so, Linda and Amanda, I'm going to bring you in on this discussion, because this is, I think, getting down to where we're talking about. Paulette talked about meeting people where they are. And by the way, I had used this term earned media that Mike had also reflected back, just so you know what that is. Basically, anytime the media covers something you do so you don't have to pay for an advertisement, it's kind of the simplest way to think about what earned media is. Obviously, paid advertising is its own world, which Paulette is involved in, but in a very unique way on some of these meeting people where they are. In a traditional way, you used to send out a press release and hope for the best. But now there's ways that you can actually generate your own content that will get covered as fact. So Linda and Amanda, that's where we're going then, is two things. One of them, how would you meet people where they are, but doing it in an ethical way? Because one of the things is it shows how easy it is to manipulate this information toward the way you want. Linda, I'll just start with you, and then Amanda, I want to make sure you hop in on this as well.
Well, I mean, I think it's a really important question, Zach, and for other folks who are watching, we often talked about meeting people where they are when we were talking about organizing in Obama world. So that's another term that people should just get straight from us. The truth is, this cycle in particular has presented so many challenges. Obviously, everybody's living in this virtual environment. We can't even have this discussion face to face. We have to do it, through this medium, which means for organizers, for people who are trying, whether they're trying to disseminate information from an educational perspective or they're actually trying to persuade and motivate people, the challenges are huge. There are upsides and downsides, right? I mean, social media, and Paulette could go into this ad nauseum, I'm sure, but the cost of placing ads and social media consumption and whatnot has actually gone down in some ways. People are answering phones, they're captive audience, as you said before, Zach. So there are, inherent benefits to that, but you're losing so much in terms of what you would normally do in regular organizing. For example, you think about in past cycles, voter registration done in person typically yielded 1 million registrations, new registrants. You would do canvassing door to door because that would help you ID people against the voter file, so you could follow up with them. That magnitude was somewhere around 17 million voter IDs, and that's something that I'm sure the Biden campaign has been focused on a lot, and trying to figure out how do we leverage digital tools and how do we not only, again, give information to people in a way that makes them feel the stakes of this election, but also literally gets them to the polls, whether that's in person or by mail, as people are wont to do this cycle. So it's definitely something that I think is going to also make people rethink what's required in future cycles. The ratio of what you put into in-person traditional field organizing versus online engagement and getting people to feel part of what you're doing. I think there's going to be a very serious debrief and discussion about it after this cycle.
Amanda?
Yeah, I have two different thoughts, a positive and a negative one. On the difference here, when you hear Paulette talk about what were they doing in the Obama administration, the intent of what you were doing was in order to inform people. It was to get people to sign up for healthcare.gov. Today, what you're seeing is some of the intent is just to get attention. That's why in one case you have a vetting process and in another case you don't. That's the negative side, is I think everyone is forced to think about whatever content they are putting out there, are they getting the attention? On the positive side, we have forced a lot more folks who are out on air, who are running campaigns, to really think about new and interesting ways to connect with people that maybe they haven't before. Particularly in 2020, when there's been a host of new folks registered to vote, a lot of different ways of attracting folks because of COVID, but also because of the intense times we're in. And I do think there will be a reckoning afterwards to figure out what worked and what didn't. My hope is that we will be able to go back to the reason why we talk to people is to inform and educate, And we'll come out of this with entirely new ways to reach communities that have never been reached before COVID, before info entertainment, or whatever we're calling it today. And so I think there's a silver lining here, but we have to be intentional as we get back into recovery, or as we get to, quote, what's normal times, is how are we using our voice, whatever side of the aisle you're on, because I think it has real implications for how this country is governed in the future.
I agree.
One other thing.
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
So I was just going to say, we've been talking about this obviously from a political context, and everything these days feel like it's political. But there are also lots of efforts underway right now that are specifically aimed at misinformation and disinformation, both in the political context and the broader public health sphere and non-political context. And I think there's going to be certainly a lot of data that is collected. You hear lots of people talk about some of the misinformation that's been moving around coronavirus specifically. For example, a lot of data is being collected now. People are working here in the States and internationally to assess how that disinformation and misinformation got put out into the world. And hopefully there will be some ways to address it in the future. And on the kind of tech, interesting digital tools front, there have been people innovating this year with bots and other kinds of tools that are literally automatically looking around our various social media platforms to identify when there's misinformation or disinformation, and then connect it to the actual factual record. So there's a lot of interesting and exciting work that's happening. It's not all bad news.
Well, Linda, that's exactly where I was going to go then on the next question. I feel like the panelists we have not really addressed the question of how do we discern the truth within these silos? Because I think ultimately, you could make an argument, and again, I've been on Fox, I'm the sacrificial dem that goes on Fox with Matt, and you should see my emails afterwards. It's like unbelievable. But people, it's a fundamentally different reality, and I'm not judging it. I'm just making it than what I believe to be true. So how do we then, for those viewers, and Matt, I'll start with you on this, but I want every panelist to chime in. This isn't just about Fox. How do we actually get somebody to discern fact from fiction? Because those of us that are on it, when we say something, if you agree with me, then it must have been true and you were on national television. But how do you actually boil that down to actually start discerning fact from fiction? What do you think, Matt?
Well, I think you don't. I don't think it's, quite frankly, this might be a controversial opinion. I think we have to understand that people are smarter than we give them credit for, right? And if they want to choose to believe one thing, they're going to choose to believe that thing. And that's been true for 60 years, since the advent of the media. Granted, there are more silos, more niches now, but I don't think that coming down on high and trying to discern it is going to be the answer. You saw a perfect example today with the New York Post and the story about Hunter Biden. When you start censoring things, or when you start coming down on high, a lot of these are private companies, like obviously Twitter is and Facebook. I think that's when you get more hostility, not less. And so, look, I think in a lot of respects, we need to give people more credit than we actually do. And I don't think that coming down, like, again, to reiterate, I don't think coming down on high, I think that will have backfiring consequences. I don't think it will help.
So you think, to give people more credit, you think that it's okay. So I should give somebody credit if they're just wrong about something that's an easily discernible fact? Because that's what I feel like a lot of worlds are operating under right now, that, in a polarized country, half the people believe one thing, half the people believe another.
Yeah, but again, I don't think that trying to instruct people that it's wrong and is going to actually help things. I think people, again, just like something's wrong, I think you have to trust that people know things wrong. And if it's not, you're not going to convince that person. I firmly believe, and that might be a controversial opinion, but I don't think that we have to give people a little more credit than we actually do for that sort of thing.
Then do you think that there's a value of having opposing voices on these siloed networks?
Of course.
But if people are going to believe what they're going to believe, then what's the value of having somebody come on? So you think that there's an ability.
My job, if I go on MSNBC or you're going on Fox, I don't go into MSNBC trying to convince the viewers of of my point of view. I think that's a lost cause. If you're watching MSNBC, I'll speak generally. You have a certain political predilection, and a 6-minute segment with some bald guy you probably never heard of. If that changes your mind, I'd be more concerned about you than anything else. It's to give opposing voices, and it's to kind of hear the full side of the argument. Convincing people is a very different thing.
Mike, what do you think? Just want to bring you in.
Well, look, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Let me explore that last part just a little bit more. Most of what we see on cable news shows is not news. Let's just be honest about it. They're not trying to articulate it. Very few of the shows on any one of the three major channels is trying to actually follow journalistic ethics. Very few. Anytime you have guests come on with opposing viewpoints, the whole purpose of this, which has been focus grouped and researched for 30 years, is to show adversarial, interactions, which is what keeps the viewer involved and engaged, angered, and then mobilized. That's the point. It's not to inform. You don't see people fighting on the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour on PBS, for example, because people are actually trying to learn and get information. What's happened with the three cable shows, and increasingly with broadcast television, the networks, is they're looking for that antagonistic dynamic because it keeps market share. And again, that's where you get into some of what Trump did and what the Lincoln Project does. These shows are not educating anybody. They're locking people down more and more into their partisan foxholes. That's the point. So, but to your original point, which is, look, because of this dynamic and because of the way the media is segmented, and because candidly media has an agenda, and that agenda is to monetize its marketplace, it's increasingly difficult to monetize objective news. There's just no money in it, which is why all of the media companies have devolved the way that they have. So how do you combat that? Well, I'm not exactly sure, but what I will say is this. The best thing to do to limit its spread is to ostracize it. It's to condemn it, and it's to attack it. You will not get rid of it that way. In many ways, you will embolden it even more, but you can shrink it, you can marginalize it, and you can limit its influence. Let me give you a perfect example. Anti-mask behavior, which began to grow as the pandemic started to spread. I was engaged with a number of public affairs efforts to actually ostracize those people and make it socially unacceptable to be somebody who was anti-mask because you were threatening the health of yourself and other people. We weren't trying to educate them on whether or not a mask worked because those people don't care, to Matt's point. They simply don't. It's their own political perspective. We politicize science. You're not going to convince this person that that's the best way to stop the spread of the pandemic because they don't even care about that. What they do care about is the social shaming of it all. And then when you can do that, you can actually limit and contain false news, fake news, and attacks on the basic underpinnings of science and verifiable fact. And that's what I think, at least in the short term, should be the objective of all of us that are fighting on behalf of truth.
Well, Paulette, thanks, Mike. Paulette, you are actually engaging in this right now in the sense that you're doing advertising on behalf of one of the presidential campaigns, among a lot of other things. How do you help people discern truth from fiction, or is it just a pure persuasion to whatever the one side is?
Sure. So I will go back to one of the things Mike said with the social shaming. I agree very much so that a lot of times we try to attack things in a certain way, but if it's not going to work, you're just sort of yelling into the abyss. Like how do you get people to pay attention? And, what is a little bit scary and connects back to this issue so much is that being a racist used to be a shameful thing. And instead people are emboldened beyond belief and feel like they can be out and proud with their racism. And we see sort of how this has happened over time. But one thing, and this is clearly not a cure-all, not even close, but I don't know if you guys saw the Harvard study that just came out recently that said Trump is the single worst spreader of misinformation, like beyond a platform, beyond another human. And it is a little horrifying to know that the leader of our country is the number one person pushing this. And I think we could have maybe assumed that, but seeing the data was pretty eye-opening. To be honest, and this is true of many past campaigns, we look at now a lot of modeling and just bringing it back to sort of campaign life. A lot of models work on, you're speaking not so much to the side that doesn't agree with you, a little bit to the side that already agrees with you and giving them sort of what they need. And you've got this sort of persuadable universe in the middle. and you're testing and sort of getting a sense of what messages can appeal to them and what things really get them. And to some degree, they found out that in past election cycles, and I'm sure we'll find out to some degree in this election cycle, there is sometimes backlash, even though you have like such a perfect model. People are people and not everyone's the same. And so as you're looking at this, you've got to kind of get more information and make sure that the actual ads you're running aren't making people angry. And one of the narratives that's been out there really consistently this year is there's so much negative on Trump that some people are actually, there's like a backlash to it, and they need to see some positive Biden because it's just not working for them to see negative after negative. So, that's another slice. So there is sort of this national narrative, but when we break it down to a campaign and a digital strategy, oftentimes it is the ability to target, and it's not like, TV, cable might be targeted, but everyone can watch it. When you're being fed ads, it oftentimes is an ad that we're very much hoping appeals to you directly. And that's something that's gotten better and better over time. I do remember this horrifying weekend I was out door knocking a few years ago, and as I knocked doors, I kept seeing signs for Republicans in the yard, and I thought, well, there's a chance that people are married to the different party. That happens all the time, but I kept knocking, and it was getting worse and worse, and I got back, and I was like, there's no way this is right. There's no way our data is right. And we had 4 days of door knocking in Ohio. That was probably 1 million doors knocked, and we were knocking the wrong doors. So you've got to be able to take data and pivot as you go, because the truth is this stuff is really imperfect as well. So, but it gets better and better, I think, year by year, and we learn more and more. But we are now chasing that group of independents who is online and trying to kind of carve them into different audiences.
And what are those numbers then, Paulette? I mean, for people watching right now, are 35% locked into one candidate, 35%, and you have like a small percentage in the middle that literally hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on persuasion? Or how small of a slice are we talking about?
It's a very small slice. I will Slack someone and see if I can get the exact number before we wrap. But it's not a big number of people that we're all going after. I mean, Hillary Clinton lost by 70,000 votes. This is not a huge number, and we're trying to make sure that we're getting those independents, and that's true, I think, across the board.
And Mike, one of the things that you're trying to do is actually grow that number from voters that don't vote very often, infrequent voters. There are, in campaigns, people tend to target maybe 3 and 4 or 4 and 4 voters, meaning people that voted in all 4 of the last elections. But in this situation, one of the things you're doing, the Lincoln Project, is also trying to turn out less likely voters, correct?
Well, we have seen some softness on the Democratic side, and so we felt, the ultimate objective of the Lincoln Project is to win. So we are doing a little bit more now of that than we were before. We never envisioned that we would do that, but there's a problem that needs to be corrected for. So we're helping out where we can as an ally, because our goal is to defeat Donald Trump. But what I will say is the bulk of our communications, the overwhelming number of our communications, is with Republicans, core Republican voters, where, again, that ostracizing effect is precisely what we are aimed at. That negative is exactly what we're doing. And there may be overkill on some of it, but we don't think so. It's why we've been able to move a record number of Republicans off of the Republican candidate, even though there's a shrinking Republican electorate. It's that contrast. It's not selling the other candidate. It's dividing the Republican electorate. And I think we've been remarkably successful at doing it to this point.
So Linda, to that point a little bit, or I guess a little bit earlier to Matt's point about the persuasion side, you're a CBS correspondent, also a Democratic strategist. When you're going on television, then how are you thinking about who you're actually messaging to? Are you trying to persuade an independent voter, or are you just trying to present it as you see it? Are you messaging more just purely on the Democratic side? This is a mindset of somebody who's actually on television all the time right now during the election, talking to us at home. So what are your thoughts when you're going on TV in that way?
Yeah, I can't speak to what other people do when they go on the air, but I don't see my role as being a talking points, talking head. I really do try to bring numbers to the conversation. I try to help people have insight into what decision makers are weighing, the campaign strategies, what people are seeing, the anecdotes that I get from voters when I've been able to travel around the country about the things that they care about. So I really see the responsibility as one of political analysis and not so much about gaming for one side or the other. Obviously, I have a long history in democratic politics. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years now of politics and communications, and I'm rooting for my team blue all the way. However, I just think that I'm more optimistic about that narrow slice that Paulette and others talked about. I do think that people want to know what's going on so they can make informed decisions. I mean, I think back to when I was the sacrificial lamb on Fox News, specifically right after the 2016 election, through inauguration week, and then for a few months thereafter before people, got out of fetal position and felt like they were able to deal with it. I just felt like Fox News, Fox and Friends in particular at the time had a viewership of 5 million people. And I just didn't think it was right to, seed the airways and assume that everybody who's watching that network is somebody who's, bought and signed, sealed, and delivered for the quote unquote other side. And what I found was interesting is that people certainly responded to me, Zach, in a similar way as what you described a little bit earlier, but there was always that, needle in the haystack. Somebody would send me this lovely message about how they appreciated the measured approach that I took and the information that I brought. And that's what kept me going. I do think that, since those halo days post 2016, that network in particular, and some of the others have really, really shifted. I think, Mike was talking about this earlier. Everybody's really, really in their foxholes now because of everything that we've seen evolve and what we've seen shake out over the last 4 years. But there's still those people out there who they may have a preferred network now. I mean, my mom is one of the people who used to watch Fox News, for example, and is now totally switched over to MSNBC. And I keep trying to tell her, actually, look for the middle, look for the information. But at any rate, I think that there are lots of people out there who may have their habits about where they're watching and what they're consuming, but that there's always an opportunity to move people. There's always an opportunity to inform people. And this cycle in particular, I think it's so critically important that whether you're on the left or you're on the right, you're arming people with basic information about how they can exercise their right to vote. There are a lot of people that I think are, in all of our networks who have been repeat voters, consistent voters. They're not those sporadics that, every cycle we talk about. How do you actually get to them and make them motivated? But even regular voters are having a hard time getting the information they need to cast their ballots in a really safe way. I mean, just today, somebody surprised me by asking about drop boxes. And so that to me is the role of traditional media. That is also a place where social media can amplify and augment, but people really do, I believe, still look to conventional news media, certainly the traditional networks, to give them this kind of information so that they can be active participants in this small d democracy.
Thanks, Linda. And I agree. So I've received those occasional emails from Fox News viewers as well. It's not the only network I'm on, but as Matt knows, we've been on a number of times together, and it is an interesting experience. I mean, the framing is very different from when I'm on a different network, but also the responses are very different. But I agree with Paulette's assessment. 70,000 voters over 3 states shows you, and a lot of those were industrial Midwestern voters that watch Fox News, by the way. I think that there should be these other voices on these networks. That's one of the ways I believe that we can help strip the fact from fiction. So Matt, bringing you in, since you're also regularly on various networks, just what is your mindset in general about what you see as your role when you're speaking to the people at home, especially during an election season?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I kind of going with Linda, I've done it both as a spokesperson for a committee or a candidate, and I've done it as an analyst, and they're obviously very different. And I think to Linda's point, I prefer it when I'm not having to adhere to a set of talking points. It's actually easier when I can do that because I know what my guardrails are. I know what I can say and what I shouldn't say, as opposed to where, when you're an analyst, it's much more free flowing. You can go whatever direction you want. I'll be honest. I frankly don't think of the audience at home when I do this. I think of kind of what I think, how I can prepare for what the person's going to ask me. I really, quite frankly, no offense, Zach, I don't really think about the other person who I'm going with. Occasionally if there's something I can respond to, but it's very much kind of preparing for who the host will be, what my thoughts are on whatever topic it is. And sometimes when they give you the topics ahead of time, it's a little dirty, a little secret. Sometimes you have to kind of think through this, because sometimes I don't have an opinion totally formed on one thing or the other. And you're right? Certain topics will be covered a certain way on certain networks or won't be covered at all. And, to your other point, it's funny, I don't get those same emails or whatever that you might, if I go on MSNBC. And I've actually, funny enough, I was talking to a buddy of mine who is in Democratic politics, and he actually had somebody match with him on Bumble just to yell at him. He was like a Bernie person. He's like a moderate Biden person. And so it's just a phenomenon that when you and I talked about it, Zach, that I've had really rarely, honestly, never experienced. I've never had somebody reach out, whether it's Twitter DM, email, anything like that, based on a TV event.
So you're lucky, Matt. Amanda, I know that you are an ABC and BBC contributor. Now, this is an international component, and I think, by the way, I've seen some of your clips that you've posted up on Twitter. I think you do an outstanding job, especially speaking to the international audience. So how is this viewed internationally? How are they addressing these kinds of issues? Are they addressing them any differently? Not just how they view the United States, per se, but on the misinformation situation.
Yeah, in some ways, they've seen it before us. In fact, they've seen some of this misinformation affect their own elections long before it happened in America. I think for the most part, it's a lot of shock and a lot of surprise, and almost wonder about what we are going to do. And I think that's a piece of how I approach the conversation with the international community. And I think we are selling ourselves short about what the potential is here for the future. I do think we can hold business leaders accountable to making sure that we have more character in what we are doing. I think if we actually want to reach our full potential as a country, we actually have to agree on facts around not only this pandemic, but what are our biggest issues that we're facing and how to address them. So a lot of my time is spent that I do believe this country can get back to a place where we don't just say, well, everyone's going to give lying news and whoever is the loudest wins. I do think this is why the presidential race matters, and why coming together as a country behind national leaders to say, how are we going to do this? What Mike is doing with the Lincoln Project is absolutely a part of the idea that one day we can come together and say, here are the facts. And I have to tell you, when I do speak to BBC, that is what's expected. We do know right now, tech companies can actually use automation to understand when communities are getting radicalized and when all of a sudden social media becomes dangerous. We have incredible tools to teach us how we can do this in a way that can actually unleash potential for good, as opposed to, I think, what we're seeing right now in this election cycle. I mean, we're clearly not there right now, but certainly the world is waiting for America to do that. And I think we still have the potential to do that, or at least I'm hoping. And I think that's what in this conversation, I'm hopeful as I hear Mike talk about what they are doing and how they've come together to address that.
Well, Amanda, why do you think then that social media, I mean, one of the things is that these networks, BBC maybe a little less, but ABC, CBS, Fox, and MSNBC and such are covering social media coverage as though it has the same journalistic integrity as the old days of journalism where you had three sources that you had to confirm one statement. So why do you think the misinformation of social media is being covered as fact by broadcast networks?
I think it's exciting and entertaining. And so it pushes profits. And until when Mike talks about social shaming, until we're social shaming businesses and leaders to not do that kind of work, I think then that makes a difference. But at the moment, it's actually feeding the campaigns, it's feeding profits, and it's feeding a lot of the pockets of profit-making news corporations. I think we can actually move ahead in a different kind of way with the right kind of leadership. And that's the hard part. What I have to say, though, is in this election cycle, we are seeing things that have never been done before. We are seeing groups come together and speak about the character of this country in a way that I'd argue in my lifetime we haven't seen. And just today, we're seeing lines out there really saying that the American people want a voice. And I hope and still believe, and I say this to BBC, that we are well positioned to be back in a place where we can actually capture a unity in order to reach more potential of America, but really of this country.
Well, Mike, I mean, if you're successful, I mean, there's a lot of other people working on this, but if the president is not reelected, let's say that the Democrats do take the Senate or have the House, Senate, and the presidency, do you really see a reset then occurring on the journalism side, or do you think that we're living in a new world where this world of misinformation is beyond just one individual and one party and is just going to continue on?
I think we need a couple of things that bring the country together, and no doubt tackling this pandemic virus can be a uniting challenge for all of us. And I think that's the part that, while it's tough to be going through right now, the silver lining is we have a clear enemy at hand. And to be able to come together and actually show the American people we can come together, political leaders, people, communities, to solve something really big in our lifetime, I think can set the stage for figuring out how media and all of the misinformation, how we can stop that and move in a direction that's much more productive for our country.
Thanks, Amanda. Mike, what do you think about those comments?
Amanda's exactly right. I'm not exactly sure how it will play in the short term, simply because so many of these media companies are monetized by clicks, like she said. She's exactly right. That's what's driving this. Remember, when there were just 3 networks, they were all monetized the same way. So there was a financial incentive to provide the best objective news. There was literally money in journalistic integrity. That's no longer the case when you have a fragmented media environment. They've got to survive by getting clicks, and that's why they follow social media opinion leaders or thought leaders. So until we get back to a need as a society to get and find common grounds and common facts, I think we've probably got more troubled waters ahead. I will say this. We have been through this before, right? William Randolph Hearst made a fortune selling what was called yellow journalism. That got us into the Spanish-American War based off of fake news. It was lies, right? This was the tabloids of its era. And at a certain point, the American public got tired of it, and there became a market for objective news sources. You see that with things like PBS. You see that with things like the BBC that Amanda's on. Those are news sources that have monetized objectivity. You're not seeing people 4 or 5 panel members strong with people screaming at each other and insulting each other and arguing with one another, because that's the way, quote unquote, news is monetized, when it's really not news at all. It's just kind of a form of Jerry Springer entertainment that speaks to something in us as human beings. We will get back to that, but we do have to, and I love their idea of saying, ostracizing those companies, to saying this is no longer acceptable anymore. We've got to find a way to have an actual national discussion about, one, what is news, common ground on what we actually agree are the news of the day, and then have an objective way of presenting that so people can decide for themselves.
Well, Paulette, a lot of this discussion, to me, we're at a university virtually. There's a lot of students that are watching this, and quite frankly, they're probably really turned off by the way that the news exists right now. There was a poll that came out today that was actually done by Dan Pfeiffer, helped fund it, of the Obama fame. And it talked about, he specifically focused on 18 to 29-year-olds. And as no surprise, they disproportionately support Biden, but they're also very unlikely to vote, mainly because they don't know his positions. Only when informed on some of his positions on climate change, criminal justice reform, are they more likely. How do you reach them? How do you make sure that they're not turned off by this process, about the fighting that Mike's talking about the Jerry Springer-esque of politics? How do we reach them with not just the truth, but also encourage them to get involved in the process?
Yeah. I think that's been a problem, not just now, but for a long time with youth. I think some feel a little cynical, some don't see how government impacts them, and that makes so much sense. But I think the way that we can reach people now, particularly people who don't trust what's in front of them, is through their friends and through other people. And it is really hard to do that to scale. But I would say, the Biden campaign and, there have been some campaigns in the past who've done a really smart job trying to figure out how to support that and allow it to thrive and make sure that it's really just authentic dialogue between people. Some people call it relational organizing. I think that's a little much, to be honest. I think it's good organizing and connecting with people that are in your community and that you know. But I do think that this person-to-person community is what matters. And I think we've already seen, for a while, we thought that a flood of celebrities saying vote would be helpful. And we've found through past cycles, it's just really not helpful to have, Jennifer Aniston telling you to vote. I mean, who gives Aniston things? I don't know. That has not worked the way that we needed it to. And I do think some of the one-on-one authentic dialogue is how we have to move people. And in 2018, we did test a lot of kind of new technology to support that. I think people were really revved up to figure out how they could help and did a lot of volunteering. And we did see numbers go up. It may be the case that everything we do doesn't matter compared to people voting against Trump, but we've got to look for every possible person that we can who we can get to vote. So we do look for people who are certainly popular and trusted and can connect with people. But I do think this is why we encourage so many people to volunteer, even if they're just connecting with the people who they have saved in their contacts on their cell phone. So that to me is the most authentic way to do it. I happen to know that I've been doing that with some of the people that I'm worried about them not voting. And I do think in my own little anecdotal way, I see it working, and we saw it work to scale in 2018. So my hope is that we learned a lot of lessons that we're now applying and that it'll work again in 2020, but just bigger.
Matt, on the Republican side, would you say something different, something similar on how to reach the youth or those that may be disaffected to the overall process?
Yeah, look, I don't necessarily disagree with Paulette. I think I think the enemy of voting is apathy, right? And I think one thing, for better or worse, Trump has done is create very little apathy. And there's very little disengagement. And I think one of Biden's most effective arguments is that if you elect me, you don't have to think about me every day. And so the omnipresence of Trump motivates people, certainly for, but I think certainly against. And one of the things I think I saw recently is Instagram is such a powerful tool for that certain one-on-one political connections, because you look at it now and it is very people personally, talk about their experiences, whether it's Instagram stories, their political opinions. And so in a way, I think the Trump effect is sometimes the best mobilization tool, because it really just totally obliterates apathy from a lot of these voters. People are going to find the reasons not to vote, but I do think that giving, Trump is a reason pro or against to vote, because he's dominated the conversation every way. And motivated people for or against.
Linda, a slight gear change, but we haven't talked about this yet, which is hacks and leaks, foreign interference, right, and undermining how the confidence in journalism. I mean, I think one of the challenges after 2016 is how should journalists cover this information? I mean, Matt had mentioned the New York Post story today. It was immediately amplified by more traditional media outlets. There's obviously been a back and forth, including how Twitter reacted on that professionally. But what do you think? How do you think that CBS, or any network for that matter, a journalist should cover information that comes through either a hack or a leak in the 2020 election? We know there's going to be more information in the next 20 days that gets put out. So what do you think is a responsible way to handle those intakes?
I mean, I think that every single news outlet is going to have to grapple with this question at some point. They've been doing it as, part of the presidential administration that we've witnessed, not so much about the hacks, but more so about how do you handle information and the way that it gets into your hands. We saw very recently, the New York Times put together that tremendous series of investigative stories about Donald Trump's tax returns, and those did not come through an open and transparent process. I think news outlets have to weigh the public good. I mean, at its core, news outlets are supposed to be about serving the public good, and the information they receive, if that's going to help their readers, their viewership better understand and better make decisions, that's probably where they'll land. But I think this is something we're going to continue to have to deal with, and that there will be different responses from different organizations. The one thing I did want to circle back on the younger voters, as of today, more than 10 million people have already cast their ballots, and nearly 800,000 of those are that young bracket that everybody's been talking about. And while we've discussed a lot tonight in my time, the issues and the kind of ugly underbelly that social media and misinformation and disinformation can convey, they've also been a vehicle for some really interesting engagement, organizing, voter registration tactics this cycle. I'm sure folks have seen, for example, there have been a number of efforts that have engaged through TikTok and using those stars and influencers to literally just meet people where they are, as we said earlier, and then give them a link so that they know how to register to vote in their home states. And, that's resulting in tens of thousands of people registering for the first time, and specifically that Gen Z demographic that is so difficult to, as Matt said, get engaged, and so difficult beyond that to actually get to act and activate.
That's awesome information. And Matt, I think you had a follow-up to the earlier comment?
Yeah, no, I would also just kind of delineate very quickly between hacks and leaks, right? Like leaks, Watergate, the tax returns, like that I think is different. Hacks where, you're stealing information. And look, like when I was at the NRCC in I think it was 2018, I was hacked, but we think probably by the Chinese or the Russians, but my emails were systematically hacked by a foreign entity, right? And I think to follow up on Linda's point, look, I had to go through my emails. I'm like, well, that's embarrassing. That won't look good, if that gets out there. And certainly, the Hillary campaign has had a very similar experience, right? But my worry wouldn't be CBS or the New York Times going through it, at least right now. I think things have evolved, right? My worry would be The Intercept or Breitbart or some random blog going through who doesn't really care what people think and then putting it out there, right? And I think that is the one thing we have to grapple with too, is with all these silos of information, you're right, there'll be good actors or, relatively, or I should say that actors that have other answerable things, advertisers, public opinion, and the like, but there'll be people on blogs who just don't want to get it out there, right? And so that is one thing I think that I would still worry about with hacks.
So what's the difference then, Matt? I mean, the information's still getting out. Why do you?
That's what I'm saying. And so then, right, if the information gets out, it'll undoubtedly have real world consequences. But then NBC, CBS, New York Times then cover those consequences. They're not reporting on the hack, but let's pretend that something gets out there. CBS doesn't cover it, but I have resigned or get fired because of what was in those emails. That's a story. That's a story Politico would cover, or the like, right? So it's very hard with those ethical decisions where you cover it and how you popularize it. I'm not defending it, but I'm just trying to work through kind of those types of consequential decisions.
Well, that's exactly why we wanted to talk about this subject. Amanda, I imagine you have a strong opinion on this as the political director for Clinton in 2016. I mean, what are you seeing right now? And for people at home trying to discern the information they're seeing either on social media or through networks that comes through one of these means, what advice would you have for journalists, and what would you like people at home to think about if they see information that comes this way?
So it's hard in the short term right now because we don't have mechanisms to really delineate where that line is. I think there's a very simple one. Is for every journalist to actually understand whether the story is true or not. I think what we have seen in 2020 a heck of a lot more is actually fake emails. Let's say, Matt, you got hacked, but it was no longer actually your email. It was a made up email. That's what makes me very nervous. As someone who actually was in a fake memo, I have to tell you, it is absolutely soul crushing, scary, etc. to see that happen. And how do you defend against something that's entirely and totally fake? We have now seen it happen with Speaker Pelosi's videos or Joe Biden's videos. And I think that where the media can really step in, and it's a very easy line to say that is too far. And even if Intercept or whomever else out there runs that, or Russian agents run those kinds of things, you make a really strong delineation there. And it seems to me that should be a first and very, very easy step so that we can handle, what's happening here and we're not attacked by foreign agents in the same way. And then from there, again, that's the low-hanging fruit. From there, really coming together to figure out how do you discern and what are the journalistic ethics of what you report and what you don't report on. I think it's a longer path to that, but we've got to start somewhere. And certainly these fake news or fake videos is an easy one to start now.
If I'm sitting at home, an average voter, then Amanda, and my Facebook feed comes up with some information that's probably fake, but I mean, I don't know that, right? So give me a tool to help discern fact from fiction then even in my own social media feed. What would I do?
Yeah, you don't know. And, and that's really incumbent on really individual people going in and figuring out where else can I find this? How do I make sure this is true or not? What do is CNN reporting on it? So right now we are actually at the beck and call of the media organizations that are out there because we haven't built this ethics tool, if you will, or the lines of engagement yet. I'll also say, and this is much longer term, and maybe it's my high school teacher coming out in me, but we've got to start teaching this stuff. I have an 8 and a 10-year-old. We have to start teaching in schools, not only civic responsibility and engagement, but really the tools around social media and discerning what's true, what's not true, and how to really use social media in a way that's informative and educational as opposed to grinding you down to your most intense feelings that can lead kids, anyone in the wrong direction.
Well, let's see if we can get a bipartisan agreement on something on this panel then. Mike, I'll start with you. A question had come through from somebody actually watching this that just wanted to know if there was any reliable source for unbiased or accurate information. If you were just trying to look at whether something you saw on your feed were true, or if you wanted to fact check something, where would you go, or where would you suggest for people to either watch or read that you would consider to be mostly accurate, if not fully accurate?
Look, I think the way I get most of my information from Twitter, which sounds kind of scary, but there's sort of a wiki model to it. If ABC, NBC, and CNN are all reporting the same thing, I feel pretty confident that the news that I'm getting is accurate. If it's from a less reliable news source and it's all one, then I'm going to wait to make sure that it's actionable or not. But that's what I'm looking for is it's kind of like with polling data. Any one poll doesn't tell you anything. You have to look for a trend line to actually make sure the veracity of the data is accurate. It should be no different with our news. You should have a number of different reliable news sources, and they don't have to be perfectly reliable enough. And if enough are echoing the same news sources, then I feel confident that what I'm getting is factually correct.
So Paulette, are you following Mike on Twitter and getting all of your news from his feed as well?
I will start to follow him on Twitter. I agree with Mike. I mean, I like to get a huge sample, and I don't always have time to, and Twitter is a great way to just distill a little bit. I try on my Twitter feed to follow a wide range of people, types of people. I try to make sure I break out of my silos, that I can see news across everywhere. And I think it has really helped. And I do think when we all sit and get our news from one place, it really, even if those reporters certainly don't have a strong bent in any way, you're only digesting that one channel. And I think it's great when we can really get a strong mix. And one thing I also do, and this is what we tried to do, particularly in my role in the White House, was to make sure we hear it not just from different news sources, but from different types of people, and making sure that there's sort of a diversity of voices across. And that to me is also important and really easy to find on Twitter. So that's another suggestion I'd have.
And Linda, I mean, you're allowed to plug CBS here and say it's the only accurate information around, but where would you suggest people get this kind of information from?
Well, obviously, they should start with CBS. Thanks for that lead in there, Zach. But I mean, I totally agree with Paulette. You need to look at a lot of different sources in order to make sure that what you're hearing is, first of all, accurate, but that you also get a sense for the contours and the nuance around whatever that piece of information happens to be. There are certainly, some of the traditional news sources that have a whole cadre of fact checkers that this is what they eat, sleep, and breathe. I mean, you think about the Washington Post, and when it cited, Donald Trump lying more than 20,000 times, I think was the last stat about this administration and the things that it's pushed out into the world. I mean, there are certainly places that people can generally go to and take a look. There are also those web-based outlets like Snopes and others that really do go out of their way to try and parse out the truth from the misinformation.
Matt, similar thoughts?
Yeah, no, look, I agree with what everybody said. I think Twitter's a good cross-section, and Mike put it best, it's a wiki model. And look, I think it was my point before, is trust. You have to trust people to be smart enough to filter through some of that stuff. I think if you follow one set of Twitter accounts, if you follow one set of news, or if you're instructed on what you try to instruct people on what is one thing and what is not one thing, that's where you get into some difficulties.
Well, we're coming up to near the end of this amazing panel, and I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to close with some thoughts before we turn it back to the university here in a minute. It can be hope and change, Paulette, if you want to be a Barack Obama type, or it can be doom and gloom if you don't. But generally, just your thoughts on things to be aware of coming into the 2020 election in regards to the media, your thoughts on where we're going in the next 4 years, irrespective of which administration is in place, and just your overall closing thoughts. Mike, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you on this.
Let me just say thanks again for the opportunity to meet with you guys. Love the panel too and the thoughts. It was a very engaging conversation. Look, every election cycle, the media changes, and every election cycle, we see another group, entity, campaign changing the way we consume information and what motivates us as voters and as citizens to engage. This election cycle is no different, and the next election cycle will be no different. I think the key metric to understand is the more diverse the voices are that are weighing in into the public square, the better. And I think we're increasingly entering a world and an environment where simply seeking one news source is extremely dangerous, because we don't know, you can't tell with certainty what is driving that information. And so more is better. And I think that's a simple rubric that we need to look at and understand and not be afraid of. I think, frankly, that's the way the system was designed, to have various types of input, even going back to our founding. And if we recommit to that, and the idea that there's a collective good and that truth can help get us there, then I think that we'll be headed towards better days. And I think a lot of the opinions and voices that you heard today from this panel, I think can add to that and provide for a really good foundation for how we can get there.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you also for joining this panel and your leadership in general. Amanda, I want to hand it over to you for your thoughts as well on closing.
Sure. I'm mindful that we're talking to a lot of students who I think will actually shape what our country looks like, what media looks like in the future, and who are more equipped than all of us to understand and to innovate on what the next chapter of social media is like, or the next chapter of the campaign that's ahead in 2024. And I guess one thing is, I don't want anyone to lose sight that we actually have the answers within our own talent. And for everybody watching, we have a moment right now that we are seeing history in the making, where people are engaging in our government in ways that I haven't seen in my lifetime. And we're going to shape what that looks like coming out of this. And so you have two choices. You could sort of feel doom and gloom with what we're going to probably experience the next couple of weeks, or you can keep your eyes on the prize of the future of how do we reimagine this in a way that truth is back in our institutions and that everyone does have a voice in this election and in this country going forward.
Outstanding. Paulette, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I like to tackle big problems, and I think we've got to start working on this from the top down. And I so appreciate what Matt was saying about trusting people. I may be a little less trusting that everyone can solve this on their own, and I think we've got to make sure we're thinking about structurally how we solve this problem, how individuals can solve this problem. And I would say we already know that if we don't have Donald Trump as president, a little piece of this goes away, and so now we have to deal with the rest of it. You know, we need to push back on international and domestic aggressors who are pushing disinformation to weaken us, and understand that people are trying to weaken our country and society, which is horrifying. We need regular people and members of Congress to understand technology and figure out how to regulate this stuff and do it in a really smart way that can provide some structure. I promise, Matt, I'm not a Democrat who wants to overregulate. But I do think it could be helpful to kind of have a frame of reference and really start thinking about this. I think media, it's taken them 4 years. They're 5% smarter than they were, but have to be able to pivot and think through how to deal with this in their own platforms and think about how they're, watching CNN. Sometimes they'll be gobsmacked by the president saying something that isn't false. And I'm like, it's been 4 years, people. Like, why are you still gobsmacked over this? Like, come on. And then I just think, again, I'm a field person at heart, and I think person to person helps. I have a family member who posts crazy, wacky crap on Facebook, and I finally call them out. I send them Snopes. I don't do it aggressively. I'm just like, don't make yourself look dumb. Look at Snopes. Check this out. We have to be willing to have government tackle this, to make sure that we're pushing businesses to tackle this. We have to personally tackle this, because I think it's just going to eat away at us. And I'm very optimistic, I think, like Amanda is, that we absolutely can fix this. And I think the pendulum will swing, and people will start to get really tired of the fighting and the craziness. And at some point it'll cease to be entertainment. And maybe that's our window to really fix it for good. I'd love to see that happening. So the students out there, please make it happen for us. We'd love to get you in here to do it.
Thanks, Paulette. Matt, we'll hand it over to you.
Yeah. Again, thank you very much for the time, Zach, and it's wonderful being with you all, the panel, and everyone watching. One thing I guess I keep thinking about is what this looks like January 21st. Let's say, for the sake of argument, Joe Biden wins, right? I think there's been a lot of focus in the media on kind of what I call like resistance porn, right? It's Trump getting frog marched out of the White House. He doesn't want to leave. Again, for the sake of argument, he loses. I think he will leave. But the fun begins on January 21st, because he's not going away, right? He has Twitter followers, CNN, cable. It's what any news channel is going to cover him. He's a former president, and he's going to weigh in and he knows what gets him eyeballs. And speaking as a Republican, right? Let's pretend I'm running communications for Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley, who's running for president in 2024. How do you then think about President Trump, who will just live tweet during a debate and control 10 to 20% of the primary electorate, which isn't a ton of people, but if you're running in a primary, we all know if we worked on campaigns, that's a lot of people. And on a whim, you can change things. So I'm not saying necessarily misinformation, but we then have to evolve our thinking of, okay, then starting January 21st, what do we do? And how do we react to that? And what is the how do we respond to that and kind of play that game? So that was kind of my mental exercise to lead y'all with.
Perfect. Linda, I'll give you the final word on the panel before we hand it over to President Ochoa. I think
part of this discussion, and to be here with all of you, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I mean, I think I agree certainly with a lot of what folks have just said in their closing remarks, and I like to think of myself as practical, but I'm also just really optimistic. And while I see, yes, there's been eroding faith in our institutions since long before the Trump era. And there are a lot of challenges in the way that the media infrastructure has been built and is continuing to evolve. Absolutely. But on the other hand, there are certainly some amazing things that we've seen as a result of what we've witnessed and lived through over the last 4 years. Investigative journalism is, I would argue, at its best since many, many years past. I think people really are trying to think of different ways to get that fundamental information out to viewers and out to readers that we probably wouldn't have seen. We wouldn't see people pushing the envelope in quite the same way, as that financial incentive is probably not enough. And I would just close by saying, I started my career 20 years ago as a grassroots organizer. And the thing that gives me the most optimism is seeing all of these people take it to the streets, whether they're doing it because of racial injustice and police violence, or they're doing it because they're really worried about climate change and the 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases that we emit into the atmosphere every single year. People have felt the inspiration and the empowerment to make their voices heard in a way that we just haven't seen in a really, really long time. And that gives me hope, even despite all of the challenges that we're living through right now.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you to the panel. President Ochoa, I'm going to hand it back to you. Thanks for letting us grace your university today and speak to the students and the community. I'd like to hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zach, for a wonderful discussion. Thank you to our distinguished panelists for providing such thoughtful insights into the brave new world of social media, crafting narratives and alternative facts. There has always been somewhat of a distinction between objective truth and conventional wisdom, especially when it comes to human affairs. And the Academy has critiqued the formation of dominant narratives as reflective of power relations that shut out the voices of marginalized communities. Even so, a social process of convergence on an agreed narrative allowed the nation to reach a working consensus and work toward common goals. The irony is that the postmodern critique has been turned on its head with the proliferation of social media and siloed information channels. Many actors with destructive agendas can now define alternate realities, making shared understandings very difficult. And that's why the tempered optimism of our panelists about the future is encouraging and inspiring to hear. I would also like to thank all of our viewers for taking the time to inform themselves on this critical issue. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government." Today's discussion shows that while an informed electorate might be trusted with their own government, the quality of that information is a critical piece of the equation. As an institution dedicated to educating and building critical thinking skills, CSUMB is pleased to utilize events such as the President's Speaker Series to raise public awareness of the issues facing our community and our nation. In these difficult times, we invite you to support CSUMB and public higher education to allow all of us to be more discerning of truth, fiction, and alternative facts. Thanks again for participating. Please stay safe and have a good evening.
Thank you for joining Cal State Monterey Bay's President Eduardo M. Ochoa for the President Speaker Series. An archive of the live presentation for this event is available on the CSUMB Facebook page. We will also feature an edited video production of the event on the CSUMB YouTube account. For those in the Monterey Bay area, 90.3 KAZU, our local NPR station, will rebroadcast an edited version of the President Speaker Series, Truth, Fiction, and Alternative Facts, on Sunday, October 25th at 9 p.m. This election year special event entitled Truth, Fiction, and Alternative Facts is the first event of the 2020-2021 program. Visit the CSUMB events calendar to learn more about special events and guest speakers presented by CSUMB for our community. Visit online at csumb.edu/events. We support your ability to vote. California residents, register to vote or verify your registration by October 19. Visit online at registertovote.ca.gov for more information. Viewers from other states, check your local or state voter registration government webpage for directions and deadlines in your area. Thank you for attending, and good evening.